If someone had told the 1,990 seconds that the woman who defined its idea of perfection would one day describe herself as brutally disfigured, the decade would have laughed. Linda Evangelista was the woman who could change an entire campaign with a haircut, the one Anna Wintour called the most super of the supermodels. Her face sold perfume, handbags, the idea of luxury itself. When she vanished from fashion's front row, around 2016, the polite assumption was that she had simply retired well, rich, private, choosing peace. The truth was much darker. It was hiding in a medical file, in a handful of frozen fat cells that refused to die, and in a legal document she refused to sign. If Linda Evangelista had agreed to keep quiet in exchange for help, the world might never have known what cool sculpting did to her body or what it nearly did to her life. She had spent her entire career understanding leverage. Linda was born in 1,965 inches, St. Catharines, Ontario, the daughter of Italian immigrants who assumed their tall, shy girl would end up in a sensible profession. She imagined law school, not catwalks. At 17, she was still a Catholic school student in a small Canadian town, self-conscious about her height and the way attention shifted when she walked into a room. Then a scout saw her in a local contest, recognized something camera-ready in the architecture of her face, and opened a door to Paris and New York. At 19, she stepped off a plane and into a world where women were treated as interchangeable mannequins, paid to disappear into clothes. Linda's instinct was the opposite. If she was going to be in the picture, she intended to shape it. By the late 1,980 seconds, the industry had learned how dangerous that instinct could be in the best sense. On set, Linda could read light the way a photographer did. She understood how a small adjustment of chin or shoulder completely changed the frame. Designers realized she was not just a hanger, she was an instrument. Karl Lagerfeld began to cut Chanel suits with her bones in mind. Gianni Versace trusted her to embody a specifically Italian fantasy of glamour. Unapologetic, expensive, alive. Steven Meisel shot her again and again because she arrived as one person and left as another. Peter Lindbergh framed her in grainy black and white, as if she were European cinema royalty. Mario Testino used her to sell both severity and softness. Week to week, she shapeshifted from Jill Sander minimalism to Versace excess to Chanel discipline. The face was constant. The woman inside it was endlessly variable. Then came the hair. In a moment that would become industry legend, a photographer suggested cutting her long hair into a sharp, boyish crop. For almost any other model, it would have been career suicide. Contracts were written around continuity. Advertisers paid for the look they had approved. Linda said yes, sat in the chair, watched her hair fall to the floor and walked out with a new face for the decade. The cut made her eyes enormous, her cheekbones almost architectural. Within weeks, clients who had booked her as one thing realized she'd become something else entirely. Salons around the world started offering the Linda. Women who would never step on a runway put their trust in the same scissors. It was the first sign of what would become a pattern. Linda was willing to risk the surface if it meant claiming more control underneath. That control was not only aesthetic, it was financial. Asked once about her day rate, she delivered the line that would follow her for the rest of her life. "We don't wake up for less than $10,000 a day." It was part joke, part boundary, and entirely accurate. Clients pretended to be scandalized. Models were supposed to be grateful, silent, vague about money. But the line landed because it exposed a fiction. Brands were making tens of millions with campaigns fronted by women whose names could sell newspapers, while still acting as if those women were lucky just to be there. Linda punctured that illusion with a single sentence and, in doing so, said out loud what a generation of models had learned to think in private. "This is work. and work has a price. The industry adjusted because it had to. By the early 1990s, Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, Christy Turlington, and Cindy Crawford were no longer just faces, they were a cast. They walked Chanel Couture and Gianni Versace's metal mesh mini-dresses. They lounged in George Michael's Freedom 90 video, refusing to lip-sync his lyrics, insisting instead on occupying the entire frame with their own charisma. Editors estimated that Linda appeared on 600 to 700 magazine covers at her peak. A single casting choice could signal whether a brand aspired to old money chic, downtown edge, or global power. Anna Wintour, a woman allergic to hyperbole, put Linda on Vogue's cover again and again, and later said there was no model more super than her. For the first time, the person inside the dress had as much leverage as the house that made it. On the page and the runway, she looked untouchable, cool, controlled, exactly where she intended to be. Off stage, the reality was more complicated. The fame was relentless, the travel endless. The more she was seen, the smaller her private life became. In the mid-1990s, her relationship with magician David Copperfield turned a naturally reserved woman into half of a public spectacle. She levitated. She disappeared. She was sawed in half on stage. Tabloids screamed about the illusion of their love. When Paris Match suggested the relationship itself was a trick, Copperfield sued for defamation and won. Linda later admitted that the circus exhausted her. She had wanted to be open. The result was to be picked apart. The lesson landed quietly. What the public is given will be consumed. Anything not defended will be taken. By the end of the decade, the industry that had built her up started to look for ways around her. Designers complained that the supermodels were overshadowing the clothes. It was cheaper and easier to send anonymous teenagers down the runway than to negotiate with women who knew what they were worth. The aesthetic itself was shifting. Grunge, heroin chic, an almost deliberate anti-glamour made her precise symmetry look, to some eyes, like yesterday's dream. Magazines that once crowned her the face of perfection began running spreads about the new realness. Girls with chipped nail polish and messy hair, photographed in dim apartments instead of on yachts. It was not that Linda stopped working. She continued to book campaigns into the 2000s. But the cultural mirror had tilted. The image that once looked like the future now risked being framed as a relic. She responded with the same discipline that had carried her through everything else. Work remained, but it no longer defined every hour of the day. In 2006, at 41, she gave birth to her son, Augustin James. His father was François-Henri Pinault, the French billionaire who oversaw a portfolio of luxury brands from Gucci to Balenciaga that had once relied on Linda and her peers to establish their mystique. After decades of time zones, hotel rooms, and back-to-back bookings, the center of gravity in her life shifted to school schedules, bedtime stories, and the small, stubborn rituals of domesticity. She still shot for houses like Prada and Fendi. She even posed pregnant on a Vogue cover, forcing fashion to look directly at a body it usually pretended did not exist. But the rhythm changed. Auditions, fittings, and shoots were no longer automatic yeses. They had to compete with parent-teacher meetings and homework. In a business that treats women as most valuable between the ages of 16 and 24. Choosing to route one's life around a child rather than a job is always more radical than it looks. By 2015, Linda was 50, extraordinarily beautiful by any real-world measure, but working in a universe that does not use real-world measurements. Social media had produced a new kind of model, whose power came not from mystery, but from constant visibility. Teenagers built careers on follower counts. Reality stars arrived at luxury campaigns, trailing millions of fans. The logistics of a modeling job had changed. If a woman did not want to dance on Instagram Live, There was a line of 20-year-olds who would, for Linda, who had built a life and a bank account on the power of her image, the slowing of calls and the closing of doors were not just professional signals, they were warnings. The face and body that had paid her bills were entering a phase the industry euphemistically calls mature. The question was how to manage that transition without losing everything. That was the context in which advertisements for cool sculpting began to look less like background noise and more like a promise. They spoke directly to women in her position, not to lose weight, but to refine contours, to deal with small, stubborn pockets of fat that remained no matter how much a person ran or counted calories. The pitch was deceptively simple. No surgery, no anesthesia, no downtime, freezing tiny areas of fat under the skin until the cells died, allowing the body to flush them away. The procedure had FDA approval, was marketed as so gentle people could do it on their lunch break and go straight back to the office, for someone whose livelihood depended on the unforgiving eye of a camera. A non-surgical touch-up sounded less like vanity than maintenance, the professional equivalent of a new haircut or a better foundation. Between August 2015 and February 2016, she sat through 7 sessions. The applicator cup went on to the places that photographs and sample garments made impossible to ignore. Under the chin and along the jawline, inside thighs, upper back, the small bulges near the bra strap by the arms, stomach, and flanks. Each area was vacuumed into the device and chilled for about an hour, the flesh first aching with cold and then going numb. Nurses told her she was an ideal candidate. She followed the instructions. The brochures said she could expect a 20 to 25% reduction in fat in each treated zone over a few months. Her job, as always, was to wait for the proof in the mirror. What appeared instead were shapes that did not belong to her at all. Where the machine had gripped, the flesh began to swell, not soft and dissolving, but hard, square, and protruding. The bulges matched the outline of the applicator. They were tender at first, then simply solid. Her jawline thickened outward, the area beneath her bra strap pushed against fabric. Stiffness crept into the places that had been treated. When she went back to her dermatologist, she was given a name: paradoxical adipose hyperplasia, PA. In plain terms, the cryolipolysis had done the opposite of what it promised. Instead of killing fat cells, it had irritated them. They had responded by multiplying and hardening. Paradoxical adipose hyperplasia was known to the company on paper. In consent forms, it was listed as a rare complication, perhaps one occurrence in 20,000 treatments. For patients, the description, firm, well-demarcated masses in the treated area, did not capture the shock of watching one's body reconfigure itself against one's will. Studies and device data would later suggest that the real incidence might be closer to 1 in 2,000 or higher, enough to make it a risk anyone considering the procedure should weigh seriously. In Linda's case, the change was not just visible but painful. The hardened fat rubbed under clothes until it abraded her skin. Without compression garments, her arms could not rest straight down along her sides. The protrusions forced them outward at a strange angle. Every movement became a reminder that the tool she had used to preserve her appearance had given her a new, alien silhouette. Her doctor contacted Zeltic, the company behind Cool Sculpting, which had by then been acquired by Allergan, a pharmaceutical giant best known for Botox. The initial response sounded sympathetic. They would help. They proposed corrective liposuction with a surgeon of their choosing, someone they said had experience treating PA. They would cover the cost. They would coordinate the care. Then came the condition. According to the court filings Linda would later make public, the offer was contingent on her signing a strict non-disclosure agreement. The help would only be available if she agreed never to speak about what had happened to her. For a woman, the industry had spent 30 years asking to be quiet about fees, about power, About what happened backstage, the timing was cruelly precise. Linda Evangelista was one of the few models who had insisted on monetary transparency, who had turned "we don't wake up for less than $10,000 into a line in the sand." She understood what silence is worth. This time, the silence was not about money. It was about her body, her capacity to work, and her name. Signing would mean accepting that what Cool Sculpting had done to her could stay, officially, an unfortunate private mishap. She refused. The price of that refusal was immediate. In June 2016, she went ahead with the first of 2 rounds of extensive liposuction, this time paying herself. Surgeons attempted to carve out the hardened masses from all affected areas. It was invasive, in a way the original advertisements for Cool Sculpting had promised she could avoid. The recovery was brutal. 8 weeks of constant compression, chin straps, arm sleeves, abdominal binders. The idea was to force the tissue to heal flat, to prevent the PAH from reasserting itself. It did not work. The bulges returned, as if her body were insisting on remembering exactly where it had been violated. A year later, in July 2017, she went back for a second, even more aggressive round. Again, she followed post-operative instructions to the letter. Again, the shapes came back. Doctors floated the possibility of a third attempt. Linda declined. The surgeries had taken their toll, and there was no guarantee that another would succeed. In medical literature, PAH has no definitive cure. Some patients see improvement with surgical removal, others do not. Some physicians try injections, some suggest waiting to see if the tissue softens over time. There is no consistent protocol that always works. Patients are left moving from clinic to clinic, paying for guesses. While she was bleeding, compressing, and healing, the marketing language of Cool Sculpting barely shifted. Company representatives told reporters that paradoxical adipose hyperplasia was a known but rare side effect. Fully disclosed in written materials, they continued to use the 1 in 20,000 statistic. Even as surgeons and device data pointed toward higher numbers, they did not publicly explain why a patient seeking help had been asked to trade her voice for treatment. In online forums and private Facebook groups, people who had undergone Cool Sculpting and developed PAH began to compare stories. Many described the same arc: enthusiastic sales pitches beforehand, evasiveness afterward, and a sudden chill when they tried to talk about what had gone wrong. For Linda, the physical transformation was only half the story. The other half was psychic. She began, as she later admitted, to speak about herself in the third person, as if the public figure called Linda Evangelista had died in 2016 and left behind someone who did not know how to inhabit her own life. She told People magazine that she no longer recognized herself as human. The bumps made everyday movements complicated. The compression garments were a constant reminder that her body now required management just to function. Her mental health deteriorated. "We call sense space health." She told Vogue she had always understood she would age. She had simply never imagined she would look like this. Desperation drove her into an extreme discipline that bordered on self-punishment. She exercised past exhaustion, as if effort could erase what the machine had done. When that failed, she stopped eating normally. She told the Washington Post that for a period she lived on water, celery, and sometimes an apple. She avoided mirrors, parties, and industry events where someone might ask what had happened. Invitations from people who had known her at her height went unanswered. In the fashion world, her absence was noted but not examined. Naomi Campbell launched business ventures. Cindy Crawford built a lifestyle empire. Christy Turlington focused on maternal health. Their trajectories fit a narrative of graceful evolution. Linda simply disappeared. At home, the consequences were impossible to hide. Her son noticed the difference long before the rest of the world did. One day, he asked her whether she remembered when she used to be happy. When she used to laugh all the time, the comment cut deeper than any headline could have. She later said she hated what the whole ordeal had done to their relationship, how the shame and withdrawal had seeped into the spaces where joy should have been. The procedure that was supposed to protect her livelihood had invaded her family life, reshaping not just her body, but the emotional texture of her home. From 2016 to 2021, Linda Evangelista, a woman whose face had once been impossible to escape in magazines, billboards, and music videos, managed to vanish almost completely from public view. No red carpets, no editorials, no brand announcements. She reported no professional income for those years. The woman who had once joked about needing 5 figures to get out of bed had no jobs to say yes or no to. She later described the period as one defined by shame and hiding. Underneath that shame simmered a quieter realization. She had chosen a treatment sold as safe and non-invasive, and the consequences had stripped her not only of work, but of her sense of self. On September 23, 2021, the silence broke. On Instagram, Linda posted a statement that read less like publicity and more like testimony. She wrote that she had been brutally disfigured by cool sculpting, that instead of reducing fat, the procedure had increased and hardened it, leaving her permanently deformed, even after undergoing 2 painful, unsuccessful corrective surgeries. She said she had lived like a recluse, wrestling with deep depression and self-loathing. The post named the condition paradoxical adipose hyperplasia, and the company, Zeltic, maker of cool sculpting. Within hours, the story ricocheted across fashion, beauty, and mainstream news. That same day, she filed a $50 million lawsuit in federal court in New York against Zeltic and its corporate parents. The complaint accused them of negligence, defective design, failure to warn, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It laid out the timeline, and 7 sessions between August 2015 and February 2016, a PAH diagnosis in June 2016, the offer of corrective surgery contingent on an NDA, 2 self-funded liposuctions, and the ensuing years of isolation. It quantified her losses as both economic and existential: disfigurement, severe emotional distress, and the collapse of a career built literal centimeter by centimeter on the runway. Media outlets that had not bothered to ask where she had gone now raced to explain her absence. CNN, ABC, CBS, The Washington Post. People each dissected the case from different angles. Some focused on the medical minutiae of PAH and the safety profile of cool sculpting's 11 million-plus treatments worldwide. Others framed it as a parable about age, beauty standards, and the cruelty of an industry that encourages women to do anything to maintain their looks and then abandons them when something goes wrong. Allergan issued a corporate statement emphasizing that cool sculpting was thoroughly studied, with more than 100 scientific publications, and that PA was a rare, well-documented side effect disclosed in consent forms. The statement did not include an apology. It did not mention the NDA. As Linda spoke, others found the courage to add their voices. People who had developed PA after cool sculpting posted photos of square, blocky bulges that matched their applicators, described being told their cases were extremely rare, even as more and more similar stories surfaced. Some had been treated dismissively by the same clinics that had eagerly sold them the procedure. In 2022, Zeltic voluntarily recalled certain cool sculpting applicator models after increased PA complaints. The FDA notice advised providers to stop using and return the affected handpieces. On paper, it was a technical correction. In the lives of patients, it was an acknowledgement that the risk Linda had linked her name to was not isolated. Her post did more than explain an absence. It forced a reckoning with how profit, secrecy, and perfection intersect. A treatment meant to smooth tiny flaws had nearly erased a woman whose face had once been considered flawless A system built on images had almost destroyed one of its most valuable images from the inside out. For 5 years, the price of Linda's refusal to sign away her voice had been solitude and suffering. Now that she was speaking, the balance began to shift. In July 2022, she announced that she had settled her lawsuit. The terms were confidential. Her statement was careful, but resolute. She was pleased. The cool sculpting matter was resolved, and looked forward to the next chapter of her life with friends and family. There was no triumphant before and after reveal because there was no neat after. The physical changes remained. What had changed was her willingness to be seen with them. Her re-entry into public life was as deliberate as her exit had been abrupt. People magazine ran an exclusive cover story featuring the first official photographs of her in years, her face partially shadowed, her posture protective but present. She said she was done hiding. She wanted to peel back the shame so others in her position would not feel alone. The distance she had once inserted by talking about her in the third person disappeared. She spoke as herself. Fashion responded with the same speed with which it had once adopted her haircut. Fendi, the Italian house she had worked with at her peak, cast her in a campaign celebrating the 25th anniversary of its baguette bag. In the images, she holds the bag close, a wide-brimmed hat casting shade across part of her face. The pose shields, but does not erase. The message is subtle. The woman in the picture has changed, but she has not vanished. On the 9th of September 2022, she did something far more public than a campaign. She walked a runway again, closing Fendi's show at New York Fashion Week. She emerged in a sweeping Tiffany blue taffeta cape over a matching gown, carrying a glittering silver baguette. Audience members, including Kim Kardashian and Sarah Jessica Parker, rose to their feet. The applause was not just for nostalgia. It was for survival. Here was a woman who had been taught her value lay in smoothness, symmetry, and youth, standing in front of the same world with visible evidence that life had not gone according to plan. That same month, British Vogue put her on its cover for the first time in over half a decade. The feature was extensive. She detailed the 5 lost years, the hunger, the sense of going mad. She confirmed the legal facts. No professional income since 2016. 7 cool sculpting sessions. 2 failed surgeries. The photographs, styled and lit with care, did not pretend to turn back time. They honored the reality of her face and body now, while also honoring the person who had carried them through so much. Support came from the women who had once shared stages and covers with her. Cindy Crawford posted messages of solidarity. Naomi Campbell wrote about the strength required to tell such a story. Helena Christensen publicly acknowledged the influence Linda had had on a generation. The Supermodel sisterhood suddenly looked less like a marketing slogan and more like an infrastructure, a net ready to catch one of their own, when the system that had benefited from her stumbled away. Soon after, Linda appeared with Cindy, Christy, and Naomi on joint September covers for both British Vogue and American Vogue. Editor Edward Enninful described their bond as sisterhood, saying that when one falls, the others lift her up. The covers synced with The Supermodels, an Apple TV Plus documentary series that recast their shared history as more than a slideshow of outfits. Seen from this distance, Linda's story no longer reads as an isolated tragedy. It becomes a case study in what happens when a culture that rewards women for looking ageless collides with a medical technology that promises to make that fantasy easier to maintain, and then fails. By returning, Linda Evangelista did not reclaim the old perfection. She did something more radical in a world that still worships the surface. She insisted that what had been done to her body did not disqualify her from being seen, heard, and paid attention to. She turned a narrative of ruin into one of reconstruction, not of skin, but of purpose. The woman who once changed fashion with a haircut transformed it again by doing something far more difficult, standing in the same spotlight, visibly altered, and saying, essentially, This is still me. Her legal victory did not come with a magical reversal. No miracle shot of her in a bikini proving everything was fine. The alien bulges did not simply melt away. The scars, physical and otherwise, remained, but the architecture of power around her shifted. By refusing to sign an NDA, by publicly naming cool sculpting and PAH, by describing the depression and self-hatred in unvarnished terms, she made it harder for companies to hide behind fine print and glowing advertisements. She gave other patients words to demand better disclosures, better data, better care. The girl who once let a stylist shear off her hair because she understood that a risk at the surface could bring more control underneath, has, decades later, taken a risk of a different kind. She has allowed the world to see what an imperfect outcome looks like on a woman who was once sold as the embodiment of perfection. In doing so, she has expanded the frame of what beauty can include, not just symmetry and glow, but honesty and endurance, the willingness to live with visible evidence that life and medicine do not always do what they promise. Her story leaves questions hanging in the air long after the headlines fade. In a culture where millions scroll past ads for non-invasive fixes every day, chasing small refinements that might mean the difference between feeling employable or invisible, how many other women are quietly signing away their voices in exchange for help when something goes wrong? In an industry built on flawless images, what does it say that one of its greatest icons had to risk public humiliation just to be believed about what a celebrated procedure did to her? And as more people curate their lives as carefully as any supermodel's portfolio, how different, really, are they from the woman who once changed her hair, then her body, trying to stay in the frame, only to discover that the most radical act of beauty left to her was not to smooth anything out, but to let the world see every contour of what survival actually looks like?